and we're going to start this session, but the presenter will be online. So we'll start with Dr. Idara Otu. He's a professor at the National Missionary Seminary of St. Paul, Abuja, Nigeria. Idara will be speaking on examining the significance of Pope Francis's social magisterium for churches in Africa. So I hope you are there.
Without any stop.
But then what do you do about the volume?
And I think that Pope Francis follows
His path of John the 23rd. The publication of Rerum Novarum marked the beginning of modern Catholic social teaching. In Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XVIII addressed the social questions arising from the changes occurring in society due to the Industrial Revolution. Though the Industrial Revolution fueled social progress, the working class was partially excluded from this progress. They were made to face miserable working conditions and lower wages, which were inadequate for a family's needs, and also disproportionate to the profits of the employers. Addressing an increasingly depreciating social order characterized by poverty, inequality, and the violation of the rights of the human person and human dignity, Pope Leo XVIII offered an analysis different from a Marxist-oriented solution, which favored class warfare and the abolition of private property. Pope Leo XVIII envisioned an ethic of solidarity that would bring all classes to cooperate to defend the rights of workers and promote private property, and also promote an economic system for employers and workers. Pope Leo XVIII envisioned an ethic of solidarity that will bring all classes to work to defend the rights of workers and promote private property, and also promote an economic system that will be beneficial for both employers and workers. Pope Francis follows this same trajectory. In his two encyclicals, he focuses on a particular social question or social issue. He offers an analysis of the issue. He interprets them in the light of the Christian faith and offers insights that would assist government and global institutions in addressing this problem. Pope Francis takes the form of dialogue in communicating his teachings to his listeners in order to persuade them and to move them to action. For example, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis focuses on caring for the earth as our common home. He acknowledges the teachings of the previous Pope on caring for creation, but at the same time, he enters into dialogue with all peoples of the world. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis describes the encyclical as presenting a new vision of fraternity and social friendship that will not remain at the level of words, but will offer an invitation to dialogue among all people of will. This dialogic approach to communication is deliberate, but the Pope seeks to empower society to respond to the social challenges of our time. The Pope maintains that the Church has no monopoly on the interpretation of social realities, and that the Church does not have all solutions to contemporary problems. Rather, the Pope adopts an approach to addressing these social questions in a way that empowers particular churches to speak out and offer alternative visions in their localities and contexts. The Pope also calls on scholars to contribute towards finding a reasonable solution to the social questions of our time. in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, the Pope writes, "The Church, in our commitment to evangelization, appreciates and encourages the charism of theologians and their scholarly efforts to advance dialogue with the world of cultures and sciences. I call on theologians to carry out this service as part of the Church's service mission." The second point that I derive from my research is prophetic witness as a dominant approach in Pope Francis' social magisterium. And so what Pope Francis is doing in his social witness is to back up his social teaching with a visible culture of simplicity and a culture of encounter. According to Massimo Vaggioli, in his book titled Pope Francis, Life and Revolution, this culture of encounter is not only with human beings, but also with the world of politics and nature. In Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, the Pope describes this dialogue of encounter as being passionate about meeting other people, seeking points of contact, building bridges, planning a project that includes everyone. He explains that a culture of encounter demands the ability to sit with other people, listen to the laments of the people we serve, especially the vulnerable and those on the margins. It is this dialogue of encounter that drives the Pope's prophetic witness, which has positive consequences for realizing the Church's social mission. And I would like here to give a couple of examples. The first is the fact that at the beginning of the pontificate of Pope Francis, he chose the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi, who was famous for his simplicity, for caring for the poor, and caring for creation. And perhaps that is why the Pope, in his first encyclical, focuses on the care of creation. Secondly, Pope Francis continually speaks of a church of the poor, a church on the side of the poor, and a church committed to serving the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized. And he demonstrates this commitment in the way the Pope personally reaches out to the poor and the marginalized of society. Take, for example, at the beginning of his pontificate, the Pope celebrated Mass for migrants on the island of Lampedusa in Italy, where he threw a wreath in the sea in memory of migrants who have been drowned trying to reach Europe. In 2015, during his trip to Africa, among the places the Pope chose to visit were the slums in Kenya, an orphanage in Uganda run by the Good Samaritan Sisters. His visit to these places made the Church's social teaching resonate with the concrete lives of the people. Early this year on Holy Thursday, the Pope washed the feet of 12 women, inmates, at a prison in Rome, notably including no man in the ritual, and assuring inmates of God's forgiveness. These examples point to a culture of encounter as a form of prophetic witness and action in the social magisterium of Pope Francis. And so for me, the question then is, what can the Church in Africa learn from these examples of Pope Francis? What can church leaders in Africa learn from this example of Pope Francis? And what can scholars in Africa learn from this example of Pope Francis? When we take a look at the social context of Africa, despite an increase in industrialization and urbanization projects, Africa is still heightened with levels of poverty and inequality. For example, in the year 2021, the GDP of Nigeria stood at 514 billion US dollars, the highest in Africa at that time. But today, more than 100 million Nigerians live in poverty. Between 2020 and 2021, the government of Kenya borrowed more than 1 trillion Kenyan shillings for industrialization projects. Yet, Nairobi is still home to one of the biggest slums in Africa. Another example is that over 60% of cobalt used for lithium batteries in smartphones, laptops, and iPads is mined from the DR Congo. Yet, Congo remains a nation in crisis. The countries of Liberia and Sierra Leone continue to export gold and diamonds to the world, yet these nations remain among the poorest in the world. The point I'm trying to make here is that in the current wave of industrial revolution, many countries of sub-Saharan Africa, even with growth in GDP and also development in infrastructures, are still struggling with the same questions of poverty and inequality that Pope Leo XIII sought to address more than 100 years ago. And so what can the church in Africa do differently? How can leaders in Africa contribute to changing the narrative? How can scholars contribute to offering a new vision of social development for the continent of Africa? In the current declining social context of Africa, Africa is also experiencing growth in the number of Christians and also growth in vocations to the consecrated and priestly life. The global Catholic population is about 1.2 million, and of which about 200 million are Africans. And it is projected to reach more than 460 million by the year 2040. In his book, The Sacrifice of Africa, The Political Theology of Africa, Emmanuel Katongole describes this paradox using a metaphor of churches and coffins to explain the hope and pain, the beauty and tragedy, the dreams and frustrations of Africa that is overwhelmingly Christian and at the same time politically, economically, and socially distressed. In conclusion, I think that Pope Francis' social magisterium shows that the church's social mission must combine prophetic witness and prophetic proclamation. Both are necessary media for change in society. For particular churches in Africa, there seems to be an overemphasis on the proclamation of the church's social teachings without a corresponding change in the lifestyle of leaders, which would contribute to a fuller realization of the church's mission in the world. More so, African theologians have the responsibility to offer an alternative vision in their theological enterprise to address the complex social questions of Africa. And I hope that the conversations that ensued after this presentation will deepen my presentation in offering the pathway to a fuller realization of the church's mission in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Idara, can you hear us? Can you say something? Are you there?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Finally. So now we have questions, and we'll take first from Simon, and then...
Idara, thank you very much for your paper. I am particularly curious of the following. Yes, it's the critique that I want to resurrect again that was made by Mary, I forgot, Hotchkiss or so, in the 1980s. She was critiquing the social teachings of the church and said, the social teachings are unable to address the ills of society because they have appropriated an anthropology that is inherently capitalistic and erasing. So that said, in the context of Africa, would you agree that the problem with the social teaching is that it's still very peripheral or surface level, because it's not just saying that Africa's problems, it's not just, oh, we are corrupt, but if I may turn to Achille Mbembe, that the very sense of statehood in Africa was created and conditioned to be exploitative, to be erasing of African lives at the expense of those, the oligarchs, whether within or outside, who are exporting the resources of Africa. And there seemed to be a very strong reluctance on the part of the church to look critically at the structures of capitalism and statehood today, especially in the colonized world, to say, okay, maybe our understanding of the structures that are there need to be re-critiqued and reimagined. Would you agree with that, that we are just dancing a chicken that is headless type of dance, and trying to solve a problem which can never be solved where we are standing, unless we ask, what does it mean to be Nigeria today, and what are the obligations and responsibilities of the state to the Nigerian?
So, Idara, did you hear the question?
Yeah.
And before you answer, please, just one thing. Could you put on your camera so that we can see you, please? Because we are now in an age of AI. I want to be clear.
Oh,
Thank you.
Yes, all right.
Beautiful. Okay, please, could you answer the question, please?
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for your question. I wouldn't agree that the Catholic social teaching is limited in its principles for social transformation and sustainable social development. Rather, I would argue that the nations of Africa have to take a fair share of the responsibility for the rot in Africa. My main concern is how the church in Africa, in terms of its leaders and scholars, can contribute to changing this narrative. I don't think there is a linear way of articulating the complex social issues that we face in Africa, but that is not also a reason for us to continually blame it on colonialism. Colonialism played a significant role, but Africans have to move on and take the bull by the horn and be able to chart the pathway for itself. So my main concern is how Pope Francis, in his own prophetic witness and way of engaging the current social ills in the global community, can become a lesson for us in Africa to contribute to changing the narrative. And I think that we have all the resources, both human and material resources, that we can use to change the narrative. And we don't even need to think of the bigger things. We have just starting from our own local communities to lead by example in a way that trigger down the change that we need in Africa.
Okay. Okay, Oscar, because we don't have much time, please.
So, there is in the 90s, there was a book that came out which referred to the Catholic social teaching as the best kept secret. That it's really not, people really don't understand it very well, and it's kind of very few, it's kind of elitist. It doesn't really, the ordinary people don't know it in the pews. The church does not teach it properly to the people. So, in your observation, what do you think Pope Francis is doing different that can remove this secrecy of the Catholic social thought, because even yesterday we had a talk here on how bishops, for example, in Kenya are not that prophetic. There's Catholic social teachings. They are not putting it into practice. There are issues that they could use Catholic social teaching to engage with, but they are not doing that. So how can this Catholic social teaching, even what Pope Francis is saying, be practicable? Can it reach the common people in the pews and have a difference, other than it being a discourse that theologians and people talk until and the church speaks about, and that has nothing to do with the people? I hope I...
Thank you. Yeah, I hope I understand you very well.
Yeah.
The old idea that the Catholic social teaching of the church is the best kept secret, I think it's still debatable, but I think it can no longer hold, because a lot has been done in Africa. If I take the example of Nigeria, for example, to educate people on the teachings of the Catholic social of the church. So, for example, we have Luxtera, is a center here in Abuja, where the Archdiocese, in collaboration with Father Eusani, on a quarterly basis, offers programs for the lay faithful to be able to learn more about the church's teachings on society and how they can become active participants in driving that social transformation. And to the second aspect of your question regarding how Pope Francis is gradually changing the narrative, for me is the fact that when you look at this document, it's sometimes a little bit long and winded, but it brings it down to some level of the ordinary man to read and to understand. And so it is not really cast in terms of metaphysical categories and that is difficult. So if you pick, for example, Fratelli Tutti, for example, to read, you can connect with the examples that he gives. And most importantly, what I find what he has done is his own personal witness. And I think that speaks a lot. Some scholars refer it to as the Francis effect. The simplicity of this Pope leaving the papal palace to live in a boarding house with more than 50 priests, the Pope that chooses to visit places that are still in war, the Pope that is open to reaching out to the vulnerable, the marginalized, the Pope that wants to take up the difficult conversations that people don't want to talk about. And I think this personal witness is what Pope Francis is bringing to the table. And for me, it is what our bishops, priests, clergy, scholars in Africa should emulate. And I think if they do so in their local communities, a lot will begin to change. And just to also give you an example, in East Africa, for example, the base communities, the basic Christian communities, many members of these communities are more socially aware than before. And in these local communities, for example, in Sudan where I serve, you see little initiative, the grassroots initiative of taking up social justice issues, for example, regarding the abuse of women, for example, the abuse of children. They are very little, but they speak a lot. For me, Catholic social teaching is no longer the best kept secret.
Okay, can we just have one little question from Josiah?
Thank you. My question is, Father, thank you for your presentation, but here in the United States, some right-wing politicians say that there was a benefit to slavery, and also we have this concept of colonial conquest of Africa had the benefits, but the slavery altered the identity of the individual, and colonialism altered the identity of the continent. So how can we address issues on altered identity where we are still searching for ourselves.
I don't think I have an answer to that question. I'm not very familiar with the American reality. So I must really say I'm not very claiming I've altered the cultural identity. Yeah, I want to rescue myself from that.
All right, I think it's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you, Father, for the presentation and for the answers you gave to the questions. So, round of applause.